God, in these human words which I speak, may there be a word from you, heard in our minds and in our hearts, that we might be made truly alive for your sake. Amen. You may be seated. You know, it occurs to me that our Palm Sunday liturgy and traditions are almost as sneaky and subversive as the event we commemorate this morning. I mean, we all showed up here to participate in a procession that is actually a protest march, even a parody, lampooning the state, the powers that be. And at the end of worship today, when we hear the Passion narrative, we will be uncomfortably reminded of how quickly and easily a gathered crowd can turn into an angry mob calling for blood. And reminded, too, of how easily we can find ourselves among it, calling for the release of Barabbas and the crucifixion of the Prince of Peace. Sneaky, subversive, uncomfortable. But it lands us exactly where we need to be, which is taking another look at the world around it and our choices around us and our choices as we move through it. And Jesus leads our way, both lightening the mood and deepening the gravity with this bit of pointed and yet somehow also comical street theater that we've all lined up to witness this morning. I call it theater because it is a performance, and it is a pointed one. It's not only in Mark, but in all three of the synoptic gospels that the text spends quite a lot of time talking about the lead up to this event, making clear all of Jesus' careful, thoughtful preparation. He has planned this little stunt, and he is pointing it directly at the Roman state and its war machine. He'll put on his own little anti-military, anti-powers of domination parade opposite Pontius Pilate's customary imperial procession, which Marcus Borg and John Dominic Crossan describe as, quote, a visual panoply of imperial power, cavalry on horses, foot soldiers, leather armor, helmets, weapons, banners, golden eagles mounted on poles, sun glinting on metal and gold. And then the sounds. We can hear the marching of feet and the creaking of leather, the clinking of bridles, the beating of drums. We can almost see the dust swirling as Pilate passes by atop a war horse. This was an annual pre-Passover spectacle of power, domination, and military might. As one writer puts it, armed heresy on horseback. And it was designed to remind the Jewish subjects who was really in charge: Rome. And Jesus, in keeping with exactly who he has shown himself to be every step along the way, has come to Jerusalem to mock it as the joke that it is. He's got it all planned. He'll choose the most unthreatening, unmilitary animal possible, a colt so young it had never even been ridden, to hobble in comically, really, into town on. It's a joke. Or perhaps more specifically, it is a protest designed to expose the Roman occupying forces and their obscene displays of power and might as the desperate joke that they are. We might feel a little bit closer to this story in years like this one. We've been watching the Israeli military, with the help of U.S. money and munitions, level Gaza and crush its people with unimaginable ferocity and impunity. Russia continues to attack Ukraine and its sovereignty in an effort to annex it and consolidate its own power. We're hearing our own politicians describing immigrants and asylum seekers at our borders not as humans, but as vermin, as illegals. Modern-day slavery persists in the Congo in order to power the cell phones in our pockets. Imperialism and its violence are as alive and well in our contemporary world as they were in the ancient one. So, as subversive as this Sunday is, maybe that is exactly why we show up on some level. Because we are so desperately hungry, aren't we? So desperately hungry for this obscene love affair we humans seem to have with violence and domination and self-enrichment at any cost. So desperate for it to be exposed as a joke. We are so hungry for something better and kinder, more human and humane, more life-giving than this. So we are here in this room, hopefully, precisely for some alternative, right? Precisely for Jesus' countercultural message of love and mercy and care and community to be more than just a beautiful ideal or a distant promise. Which is why I want us to pay attention to the ending of this gospel lesson this morning, too. Then he entered Jerusalem and went into the temple, Mark writes, and when he had looked around at everything, as it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. That's it. That's all? After all of this, Jesus went to all of this trouble planning this very particular demonstration in Jerusalem, and when it's over, he what? Wanders around town for a while, maybe has an ice cream cone, checks his watch, goes back to the hotel early for some shut-eye. It feels extremely and disappointingly anticlimactic, doesn't it? After all that palm waving we just did? Maybe that's precisely the point. And I think it's a point so countercultural and subversive that we are likely to miss it altogether if we're not paying attention, because I think it signals a complete and total disavowal of the system. Jesus is utterly unmoved by the machinations of empire or by the anxious flurry of the culture because he is so deeply rooted in something else. He seems to resist the fervor with almost mind-boggling nonchalance, right? Because he hasn't bought into the desperation behind it. And perhaps most importantly, Jesus resists being drawn into the churn in order to let it expose itself for what it is, right? In order that we can see it clearly and with God's help, choose something different. A story. When I lived in Chicago, I didn't own a car, and so instead I took the train and the buses everywhere. And I remember one particular ride when I was headed out of town. I was going to fly out of O'Hare, which, if you are familiar with Chicago, you know is on the far north end of the city. And I lived on the south side. So this meant a very, very long train ride that involved switching trains at some point where the lines weren't quite close enough together. So this very long, seemingly endless underground corridor to walk from one train line to the other. And I hadn't left myself quite as much time as I should have, so I was in a hurry, and so was just about everyone else around me. You've been on public transit before, you know what it's like. And we've all seen buskers performing too. Some are better than others. But this one, who had posted up in this endless, echoey underground corridor, he had something truly special. So special, in fact, that I was compelled to stop and listen despite my rush. It was like this just miraculous and unexpected little gift in the middle of my day. And as I stood there listening to him sing a cappella and play the violin, alternately, I looked around me and saw that a very large crowd had gathered, had stopped to listen. He had broken the spell that had us all convinced that we needed to be in such a terrible hurry. He was, in that simple moment, occupying a space utterly outside of all of our anxious fervor, presenting to us an alternate reality and an invitation to step into it with him. I and many of the people on that train accepted that invitation, and I can't speak for those folks, but I can tell you that it sure did change my day. With his whole ministry, life, and death, and quite pointedly on Palm Sunday, Jesus extends to us the invitation to a different kind of life, a different way of being in the world and of being in relationship. And one of the ways that he extends this invitation is by modeling what it looks like to accept it. Right? It means opting for a different sort of procession, one that centers on humility and not domination. It means resisting the pull of the fervor and the anxiety that can drive so much of our lives. It means not fighting imperial fire with fire of our own, but laying down our swords and stepping into the alternate reality of peace and mutual care. It's like Audre Lorde said, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. If we want things to change, we must be willing to be changed. It's not about a nip and a tuck to what already is, but rather about choosing something altogether other, right? Something so radically different from the world that even entertaining the idea is both subversive and uncomfortable. And accepting the invitation to inhabit that different world, if only for a moment, right? If only for the duration of a bit of street theater or the duration of a busker's tune. Because we get free by living into freedom. And we find peace not on the other side of war, but by practicing peace in the midst of a war-hungry world. Living into it as an alternative, even at our own peril, or the peril of our own comfort at the minimum, right? That last bit is always the hardest part, but we have an example and a guide. He is hobbling in on a colt and then going to bed early. He's going to need his rest, after all. It's a hard road ahead this week. But what we can see from here is that paradoxically, it is by following Jesus where he leads, toward Golgotha, toward the cross, toward death, that ultimately we find a new resurrection sort of life. That's next week's story. This week, it's a protest march, the eerie silence that follows it, and the task of bearing witness to what is and to what could be. Amen.